friends and members of the campus community and also the Greater Scranton community. Thank you for being here with us. I know this is a dead week before our final exam next week. And so it's amazing that we saw so many wonderful students showing up today as well, together with the professors, the staffs, and so on. So welcome again. This evening, Asian Studies, together with the Taiwan Ministry of Culture and the multiple programs at the University of Scranton, including the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, History, Political Science, International Studies, Catholic Studies, and the Office of Multicultural Affairs, are proud to bring to you our distinguished speaker, Dr. Richard Madsen. And it is our hope that tonight's lecture can help us deepen our understanding of the other side of the world, that is Asia, a region that is so intimately interconnected with us in this global community in so many ways. Dr. Madsen is a distinguished professor of sociology and the acting provost of Eleanor Roosevelt College at the University of California, San Diego. He specializes in sociology of religion, comparative sociology, Chinese society, and moral anthropology. He received an MA in Asian Studies and a PhD degree in sociology from Harvard University. He has authored and co-authored 12 books on Chinese culture, American culture, and international relations. His best-known works on American culture are those written with Robert Bellah, William Sullivan, Ann Swidler, and Stephen Tipton. They are Habits of the Heart by University of California, Berkeley, and also The Good Society. These books explore and criticize the culture of individualism and the institutions that sustain it. Habits of the Heart, as you have seen on the flyer and the poster, won the LA Times Book Award and was jury nominated for Pulitzer Prize. His books on China, including Democracy's Dharma, Religious Renaissance, and Political Development in Taiwan, Chen Village under Mao and Deng, Morality and Power in a Chinese Village, China's Catholics, Tragedy and Hope in an Emerging Civil Society. All these are published by Berkeley University of California Press, among many other works. His books on social theory include Meaning and Modernity by University of California Press, and also The Many and the One, Religious and Secular Perspectives on Ethical Pluralism in the Modern World by Princeton University. Many of us here are familiar with Dr. Madsen's work and are inspired by him, myself included. His book, Democracy's Dharma, Religious Renaissance and Political Development in Taiwan, has deepened my own understanding about my own heritage. As many of you know, I came from Taiwan. In a recent essay in memory of Robert Bellah, one of the co-authors for the Habits of the Heart, is an outstanding scholar and a public intellectual of our time, recently passed away. So Dr. Madsen wrote an essay in memory of him, and here is what he wrote. Quote, Bellah began his classic Habits of the Heart in the prophetic voice, asking the great questions. How ought we live? How do we think about how to live? He and his co-authors, of whom I was proud to be one, set out to engage such questions. For Bellah, thinkers such as Confucius and Mencius were not simply creators of systems of thought. They were friends in history, conversation partners. The same was true of Socrates and Plato, Isaiah and Jeremiah, the Buddha and more recent thinkers like Kant and Hegel, Weber and Durkheim. In the end, for Bella, culture was not a static system of values, but a long conversation, carried on throughout history by people struggling within their own traditions to find the meaning of a good life. He saw it as his task to further that conversation with the widest possible network of conversation partners. For the past 35 years, I was privileged to be one of his proximate conversation partners. End quote. Therefore, I will say, may we also say that we are privileged to have Dr. Madsen with us tonight in this great circle of friends. Let's welcome Dr. Richard Madsen.
Well, thank you very, very much, Anne. And thank you all very much for your very, very kind hospitality. It's a great honor and privilege to be with you all. This is my first time in Scranton, but because for a while I was with the Maryknoll Fathers and our order had its minor seminary here, although I didn't go to it, this was part of the roots of what made me what I am. When I began this particular path of studying about China, which happened more or less through accident, I had said what I wanted to be was a kind of a bridge builder between East and West to help Chinese people understand America, to help Americans understand China. So I've been trying to do this in the past 30 to 40 years. And so I hope tonight will be another stage in this and to engage in conversation with you all about some of the differences and similarities and transformations taking place in East and West. So tonight I want to talk about religious transformations in Asia, especially Chinese-speaking Asia. And there's been remarkable religious renaissance in Chinese parts of Asia, and a renaissance which confounds and shakes some of the foundations of our both social scientific and our religious thought. A fundamental pillar of modern social science is the so-called secularization thesis, the idea that modernization brings secularity and secularization inevitably. The religious revival in China begins to challenge that. Most social scientists believed that after religion had been really very brutally persecuted and suppressed during the era of Mao Zedong in China, that it was gone, dead, better for worse, and the problems of China thereafter would be more problems of political economy and so forth. But religion has popped up. And now there are millions of temples being rebuilt in China, literally, as well as very, very powerful religious movements sweeping the country. By semi-official government statistics, there are about 300 million religious believers in China today. But then if you do surveys and try to ask people how often they, say, carry out some rituals in honor of their dead relatives and parents and carry out kind of religious rituals during weddings and so forth and so on, probably by those standards, about 85% of the people in China practice some form of religion, which is basically the same percentage that polls say we have here in the United States. So there's been religious revival in China that confounds the secularization thesis. The political scientists and sociologists also thought the secularization was inevitable in places like Taiwan and Hong Kong. Inevitable because these countries went through rapid urbanization, industrialization, and they assumed that in urban industrial society, religion would be basically a thing of the past. And this way of thinking was not just secular social scientific thinking, also religious people felt the same way. For instance, I know many old missionaries who thought that in China, the churches would be wiped out. As they saw it, the people they had converted were mostly very, very poor and very uneducated people, many of whom had come into the churches because of, they were rice Christians, because the church was giving them free food, and that once they went through this persecution, basically they'd be gone. And it didn't happen that way. See, churches are extremely vital and so forth today in China. The same missionaries that I know talked about Taiwan, and they saw a decline in their churches in Taiwan into the 1980s. And they said, well, the reason for this is that people in Taiwan have now become rich. As economic development is taking place, and now they become rich. They feel they don't need religion, and so religion is going to fade away. So even the religious people assume that when you have urbanization, industrialization, economic development, and so forth, the religion will fade away. And that didn't happen in Taiwan either. What you've seen in Taiwan, especially in the past 30 years, is remarkable religious renaissance, especially among the Taiwan urban middle classes, with new forms of religious practice and spirituality. They're having a very, very profound influence on the society and the culture. So to study these things is to study things that kind of attack some of the very pillars of our basic understanding of where the world has been going. And basically we're going to have to need new frameworks to kind of deal with this complicated 21st century that we're in. Now, I said there's been this big religious revival, renaissance in both China, mainland China, People's Republic of China, and in Taiwan. But one interesting thing is it takes very different forms in both places. And I'll talk a little bit about the differences and then I'll eventually try to explain why these differences have occurred and maybe point toward the future. Now, in the differences, the two levels of differences. One that has to do with the relationship between religion and the state, religion and the government. Now in China, in People's Republic of China, the relationship between religion and the state is, to put it mildly, rocky. Okay? Sometimes the government tolerates certain kinds of practices and then it cracks down, and sometimes the reason it cracks down are capricious and arbitrary and so forth, and it's constantly kind of an unstable situation, but there's a lot of tension, a lot of conflict, a lot of heartache and so forth connected with, and a lot of consternation connected with this religious problem, not to mention issues of human rights violations and so forth. Taiwan, on the other hand, relationship with religion and the government is relatively harmonious and has been the past 25 years. There's tensions, as there would be in any situation, but basically it's quite harmonious, and on balance, the religious movements in Taiwan have played, I would think, an important role in helping to maintain the viability and sustainability of Taiwan's transition to democracy. So two different kinds of patterns of religion and the state. Another interesting difference is in the substantive content of the religions that matter. In China today, the most dynamic religions, I think, and also the ones that get the most conflict, are forms of Christianity and also so-called new religious movements like the so-called Falun Gong in China. Christianity, especially Protestant evangelical, almost quasi-Pentecostal Christianity, has been growing like wildfire in China. There were less than 1 million Protestants in China before 1949 when the communists took over, and then they were persecuted and so forth, and almost wiped out probably. And then all of a sudden they started growing after 1980 when things loosened up, and now there are easily over 50 million Protestants in China, and some people put the number far higher. So it's been extremely rapid, almost exponential kind of trajectory of growth. Not just fast growth for the Catholics, but with them too, there's considerable enthusiasm and so forth. And with that comes various kinds of conflict. So very rapid growth in Christianity, and then there's been the growth of these new religious movements like the Falun Gong have been put down extremely brutally by the government, and some of it's still underground. But things like that, I think, will keep popping up. You have Buddhism in China, which is, they've opened a lot of temples recently. But one thing about the Buddhism in China is that the government works very hard to make sure that there are no Buddhist lay associations of any size. So monks stay inside the temple. People come to carry out various rituals and worship on various kinds of occasions in the temple. But what the government doesn't want them to do, and the Buddhists aren't willing or able to do now, is organize lay people to study Buddhism, to develop the faith, to help carry it out and propagate it and so forth, any kind of organized way. So Buddhism is popular but relatively quiescent in China. Whereas what's really been very dynamic and expansive and so forth, and sometimes getting in serious conflict with the government, has been Christianity and these new religious movements. Now in Taiwan, it's kind of the opposite. Christianity has been on the decline in China. There was a rapid increase in Christian conversions in the 1950s and early 60s, and then that flattened out and then just plunged. And now the Christian churches in Taiwan are not very vital, with the one main exception being the Taiwan Presbyterian Church, which for a long time has been kind of a conduit for a Taiwan sort of cultural nationalism for over 100 years. But the other churches, including the Catholic Church, are sort of in decline in many, many ways, and don't seem to have a lot of energy. But what's growing very spectacularly in Taiwan are various kinds of Buddhist organizations, one that attract very large lay followings, and to some degree certain kinds of what I call reformed Taoist associations. One thing about these are they're extremely dynamic. They make enormously creative use of modern media, multimedia, and so forth. They organize very, very large numbers of followers and are doing very creative things with the Taiwan culture and indeed with the global culture. And this is especially a phenomenon among the urban middle classes. A lot of the movements in China were phenomenon among the rural classes. Oh, that's beginning to change. So how do we explain these patterns? And what are the consequences going to be? Well, let me talk a little bit, just briefly, just to show a few pictures, just very few, about mainland China, to give you a sense of various kinds of religious conflict going on there. But then I'll spend actually most of the time, talking about Taiwan, which was the subject of that book that Professor Pong White talked about. So here is just a picture that I took of the main cathedral in Shanghai, St. Ignatius Cathedral, Jesuit cathedral, of course. And it's a big church which on a regular Sunday, and this is just taken a regular Sunday, is packed with people, packed with worshipers who are very enthusiastic and very devoted. So that's a very, very large church, and you see now how crowded it is on a Sunday. So in many ways, the Catholic Church is very vital in China. There's a lot of enthusiasm. In fact, more enthusiasm than Catholic parishes here. When I was doing some research on that, I asked some people there, I said, the Mass is long, all these people are there, you're there all the time, you stay after Mass for prayers and so forth. Here in my American parish, they don't do that. And he said, well, we Catholics in the third world are more devout than you in the first world, is what the answer was. But in any case, there's a certain kind of devotion there that's really quite impressive. But there are various kinds of problems. Now in Shanghai, a major problem these days is that the old bishop, who had done a very, very complicated balancing act between the demands of the government and the demands of the government so-called Catholic Patriotic Association, which is the government organization for controlling religion, demands of them and the demands of the faithful. He did a balancing act and kind of kept the church expanding and going pretty well in the past decades. He just died recently. A new bishop was anointed. And this new bishop, right after his ordination as a bishop, announced to everybody that he was resigning from the so-called Catholic Patriotic Association, the government control mechanism for religion. And the government promptly arrested him and put him under house arrest, and he's been under house arrest ever since for the past over a year now. And it's kind of an international human rights issue and so forth. In the meantime, the church is sort of split between those people who want to maybe more compromise with the government and those who so-called underground Catholics who are divided. So you get just to get a sense of some of the conflicts here. Here's just a couple other pictures that want to show just to illustrate a few of these things. Here is a seminary in northern China. This big, massive hulk of a building is actually this seminary. And let me just see if I can do the slideshow. Here we go. And that's for the northern part of China called the Hebei Diocese. And that's under the control of the Catholic Patriotic Association, but some people in it have been resisting it. And the government just fired the rector, deposed him, and put a new person in who was seen as more of a stooge of the government. And so the students all there went on a strike and have had a big kind of standoff because of that. So once again, you see a little bit of the conflict. Let's see. This is a small chapel, Catholic chapel. This is another kind of storefront Catholic church. This picture here, this woman here on the side is actually a Catholic nun, and she's working within the Catholic official church, sort of, but she's doing something sort of illegal. The other woman is a peasant woman from a village in northern China where all the women went to the local hospital to give birth to their babies. And the hospital gave them blood tainted with AIDS. And so they all have AIDS, and their children do too, and their husbands, and the thing is a total mess. And the government doesn't want to accept any responsibility for it, just wants to let them die. So the nuns have moved in there and had a little center to try to help them in various ways, giving both material and spiritual counseling, etc. But the government's kicked the nuns out because it doesn't want anyone to take care of these people. And the nuns are now, that nun, she's opened up a new center further away so that the villagers can come and try to get help from them and so forth. So she's doing something sort of illegal that the government, the local government at least, doesn't want done. And she feels that, because of her Christian responsibilities and so forth, she ought to do that. And so even though she's sort of part of the official church, she's because of her conscience and commitment, she's going in a somewhat different direction. So once again, you see a little bit of the conflict, okay? Now, these couple pictures here, this is underground church, this village here. This sign says, may the great Pope live, have a long life. And they're supporting the Pope over against the dictates of the government. And here's the church, and they used an old farmhouse and kind of made a church for themselves there. Some of the priests, they used to have a very beautiful church there, but they had built it without the government's permission. So the government came in and tore it apart and blew it up and tore it down. And people are extremely upset. But now they moved into this kind of farmhouse and this kind of makeshift church and so forth. So I just mention these things, and very quickly, just to kind of give you a sense of some of the tensions and conflicts surrounding religious practice in China today. And I had a few pictures about the Catholic Church, but you could do it about other religions and so forth as well. Okay. So now they'll let me turn to the situation in Taiwan. The movements that have grown most rapidly in Taiwan have been among the urban middle classes, have been what you could call worldly engaged Buddhism, Renjian Fo, they say in Chinese, and people have debates about how you should translate it. Humanistic Buddhism, some people call it. And what's this like? The main tenet probably in it is that to leave the world, that is to seek salvation, outside this world, you have to enter the world. And you have to enter the world and make this world a better place. And a better place means a world in which people have mutual care for each other and show love and concern for everybody. And so that's the main task. And unlike Buddhism, as it's often depicted, at least here, say in America, when it's individualistic Americans get on it, in which people focus on kind of meditating on themselves and kind of lifting themselves out from the world, this is extremely social. And it's involved kind of transforming and changing the world and dedicating your life to it. There are a number of major groups that I described in this book of mine. The three major ones are Buddha's Light Mountain. This was founded by a monk named Xingyun, 1967, but it's grown to a huge establishment today. In the southern part of Taiwan, it's a huge monastery complex, and now a huge new center covering many, many, many acres. And in the monastery, they have at least 1,500 monks and nuns, and overall in their organization, they have over 3,000 monks and nuns. And many of these people, the monks and nuns, are highly educated, and some of them have PhDs and are very sophisticated, and it's quite remarkable. I mentioned to them when I was there that here in the United States, for example, a lot of women have been leaving, religious life, convents. There are not many orders of nuns aren't gaining a lot of new members and all that. But there in Taiwan, lots of new people have been coming, and people who are really very successful and very well educated and so forth. And so there's a kind of an energy going into this that's really quite remarkable by any standards. So Buddha's Light Mountain has about maybe 3,000, 3,500 in all around the world, maybe 1,500 or so at their main monastery in Taipei. But they have monasteries all over Taiwan, and for that matter, all over the United States. They have one in Los Angeles, which is they say the biggest Buddhist monastery in America. It's called the Shilai Temple. And they have branches here, certainly here in the East Coast, in New Jersey, New York, and in Florida, I believe, and Chicago, and anyway. And they have centers and little monasteries and places in 130 countries around the world, including all throughout Southeast Asia, places like Malaysia, but also in Australia, also in South Africa, also throughout many countries in Europe, as well as now Canada, parts of Latin America, and so forth. So it's a truly kind of global movement. And they have an association called the Buddha's Light International Association, which is an association of lay people, which they claim is one of the largest independent lay organizations, civic organizations in the world, up there with the groups like the Rotary Club and so forth, in terms of the number of the membership and the kind of global reach that they have. And these lay people in their organization do lots of works of charity, helping poor and sick and so forth, as well as helping to carry out various kinds of rituals to propagate Buddhism and to publish Buddhist works and so forth. So, and Xingyun, their founding master, he's now about 85 years old. He goes throughout, he's traveled the whole world. He's visited with the Pope and world leaders and so forth, and all throughout Southeast Asia, and he gives these big Dharma talks, so-called, like big sermons, to packed football stadiums in places like Hong Kong, Kuala Lumpur, holding 40, 50,000 people and so forth. He reminds me a little bit, actually, of someone like Billy Graham. He's very, he might not be the most profound theologian in the world, but he's extremely well organized, an extremely good speaker, and knows how to communicate with people and so forth, and inspire people, and he does that. Okay, so that's Buddha's Light Mountain. Another group that I studied was called Dharma Drum Mountain. Its founder, named Shengyan, was a monk that's established a smaller temple, maybe has about a couple hundred monks and nuns on it, and maybe 500,000 or so lay followers, but many others. But it basically is attractive more to intellectuals and educated people. And they have lots of study groups and groups to discuss aspects of Buddhism and so forth. A lot of professors and people like that join up and take part. They also, through the lay association, carry out many kinds of works of charity. They have a modern university they just established in Taiwan, northern Taiwan. Buddha's Light Mountain, as I just talked about, has 3 universities in Taiwan, has one here in the the United States in Los Angeles, and other kinds of colleges and institutes of education and research throughout the world. So they're into education in a big way. Dharma Drum Mountain has centers, at least a dozen, in different states here in the United States. They started out with a center in New York, around New York City, and they have a big retreat center in upstate New York, but then they have smaller centers in New Jersey and Florida and so forth. Pennsylvania, I'm not so sure about. In Chicago, certainly, and a number of them in California. So, and once again, these are groups with kind of a global reach, attracting a global following and claim to have a message for the world. Then, third group, which I'll talk a little more about, because I have some good pictures on it, is the group called Tzu Chi. Tzu Chi is a foundation established by a Buddhist nun named Zheng Yan. And its center is the building here in this picture. It's in a remote part of what used to be a pretty remote part of Taiwan, called Hualien, the eastern part of Taiwan. That is a monastery, nunnery for about 100 nuns. One difference between a monastery and so forth is that if you have a male master, a leader, you can have a monastery that includes both nuns and monks. They live separately, of course, but they can be part of the same complex. If you have a female leader like Zheng Yan, you only have nuns. Okay, so it's a gender issue in Buddhism. In any case, so this monastery has about 100 nuns. Some of them, too, quite well educated. There's one young woman I know who got her degree from Stanford, and then she went to Taiwan, and now she's one of their kind of leading, members in this organization and so forth. And here's a picture of Master Zheng Yan here, giving out some things to some of her followers. And although there's a small monastery there, they have 4 million members. Taiwan only has about 23 million people, so it's very impressive. And they have 4 million lay members who basically become a member by pledging to give a certain amount of money every month to sustain it, and then by being available to carry out various kinds of works of charity. And then the members, there are different kind of circles of membership. And the inner circle is a group of so-called commissioners, about 20,000 of them, 2/3 women, and there's a third men. They use a slightly different term for the men commissioners. And they devote an enormous amount of their time and energy to carrying out good works of charity, under the inspiration of this master. They're a little bit like, say, in America or American Catholicism, like a third order of a religion, like third orders of St. Francis or something like that, in which they basically just devote an enormous amount of time and prayer and good works and so forth. They wear this distinctive kind of uniform. The women, this navy blue kind of dress. And you see them in streets and elsewhere around the world. This here is me and Master Zheng Yan, and that's my wife on the side, because I interviewed her and did some of my research on her organization. They do a number of things for their good works. They started out becoming famous, at the very beginning famous for giving help to people in need, disaster relief and so forth, in Taiwan. And then they later moved to medicine. And so they became famous in the 1980s by establishing a major hospital in this remote eastern part of Taiwan. And now they have 3 hospitals in Taiwan, which are major first-rate, state-of-the-art medical centers. They have a medical school and a university connected with it. And then around the world, they have things like free clinics. They have one in Los Angeles serving poor people for free and so forth, and do various kinds of medical work. Okay. And then besides that, they do this relief of people in suffering kind of work. And after 1990, they suddenly went global. And now they are around the world. And they go everywhere where people are in distress and in need, especially from natural disasters, but just also generally from poverty and so forth. And part of their effort and their philosophy is to mobilize these 4 billion people to give energy, charity, and so forth to people in need, and to extend their circle of people that they would give to go beyond their family, to go beyond their neighbors, to beyond even people in Taiwan, to try to reach out to people even who would be their enemies, or people who are very, very different from them culturally. So they go a lot, many, many times, and have done an awful lot of work in mainland China. They were a major presence during the terrible earthquakes in Sichuan province in 2008. But they also go to North Korea, help alleviate famine there. They've been throughout Southeast Asia, all the countries. They're certainly in Philippines right now, helping victims of the typhoon Haiyan. In Indonesia, they did major work for the tsunami there. They've been through Muslim countries like Bangladesh and Turkey. They've been to Rwanda and Kosovo during the terrible conflicts there. They've been throughout Europe. They've been here in the United States, most recently helping out after the Superstorm Sandy, but during Hurricane Katrina and many other disasters that have taken place here. Also many places in Latin America. And they give out various kinds of aid. They become very, very good at responding to people in emergencies, setting up temporary housing and providing food and other kinds of relief, et cetera. And they become very, very expert and professionalized about this. They insist on giving the aid person to person. That's one of their characteristics, not just kind of writing checks and doing it, but mobilizing people to go. And whenever they give out their aid, they want to do it face to face, hand it to the person, smile, tell them they're grateful to be able to help, and so forth. And anyway, and they've done this in a truly kind of global fashion. Another thing that they do is they got the education. They've got the universities. They have private middle school, which is kind of a model middle schools they have in Taiwan. They have kind of a program for values education that's been used in Taiwan, and so forth. They have branches around the world, including here in the United States, including in New York, New Jersey, certainly. Philadelphia, maybe, I'm not sure. Certainly in California. In Los Angeles, they have a big new center in which basically it's in San Dimas, which used to be the big seminary for the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, the minor seminary, and the diocese had to sell it because of need for money for various reasons, as you know, recently, and so they sold it to the Buddhists and so forth, and now they occupy that seminary there. But they're all over. I forget how many centers they have in the United States, but also in South Africa, Europe, and so forth. And so they're truly kind of global. Now, to get a sense of what their philosophy is and how they operate, some of their main principles are in Buddhism that it's first of all a religious secular kind of enterprise. For them, for Tzu Chi, but also for Buddha's Light Mountain, and I think for Fagu-shan, but I heard Master of Buddha's Light Mountain say directly, we don't believe that the Buddha's a god. We believe that Buddha was a man who learned about and who became enlightened, and whose enlightenment can show us the way forward. And what does enlightenment teach? It teaches that basically you don't have an individual self, that grasping individual self that you think you know is not your real self. Your real self is part of interdependent web of relationships, mutually interdependent. And to be enlightened is to fully realize that and to accept that. And the way to do that there are different ways. Some of them are through various kinds of rituals. But for Tzu Chi especially, is to reach out beyond yourself in works of charity and works of compassion for others. So they're going out to their enemies, going out to people far distant from them in culture and so forth, is in a way for them a kind of a spiritual exercise. It's like you do when you sit zazen or something and you have to sit in this lotus position until your knees and legs are aching with pain, and then you keep on sitting and go through that and so forth to reach that stage. Well, you reach this state, this understanding of interconnection by going out and giving to people, even the people you wouldn't normally want to give to, and pushing yourself and pushing your heart and opening your heart and creating a big heart and a great love out of the small loves that you have. So that's their basic philosophy that kind of energizes them to kind of create this kind of vision of this world. Another part is that your salvation is within this world. So one big theme in Asian Buddhism is so-called Pure Land Buddhism, and that the idea is that you're reincarnated after you die, and if you have enough merit, you won't get reincarnated as a person or even worse as an animal or something like that, but you get reincarnated into a pure land, which is like heaven. It's a wonderful, glorious, wonderful place beyond this world, and you live there for billions of years and so forth. It's like leaving this world and going to heaven. But for them, the Pure Land is here, and their task is to make this world a pure land. So, for example, some of them think that in their hospital, sometimes a woman comes in for fertility treatments, and sometimes doctors determine after trying different treatments that the woman, can't conceive a child. Every once in a while, one of these women actually does get pregnant. And then some of them believe that that's one of their own deceased members coming back, giving joy to this family and so forth, but also there to kind of bring love and so forth in this world to make it a better world and so forth and so on. So it's a kind of a vision of reforming and creating and making this world more loving and putting your energy into doing that. To do this, they believe that you have to adapt Buddhism to life as well as to kind of lift the world up. And all these groups I talked about, Buddha's Light Mountain, Dharma Drum Mountain, have a similar process, say the same kind of thing. So to adapt Buddhism to life, what would that mean? You make some compromises in certain ways with classic Buddhist doctrine. So the first precept in Buddhism is basically there's no killing, okay? No killing any living beings, any sentient beings, okay? So they're vegetarians and so forth. And what that means in their monastery, in that nunnery, they won't even kill a mosquito or an ant, okay? They use incense and stuff to try to keep them away, but they'll try not to kill even a bug, okay? Because that's wrong, it's killing any kind of living being. Then I asked them in a medical school, this is a scientific medical school and a scientific hospital. You do all sorts of medical research. You do research on animals, which you have to kill the animal. They said, yes, of course. This is modern scientific medicine, and you have to do you have to do research, and some of the research involves killing, mice and whatever. And the master says this is okay to do this as long as you treat the animals humanely, and it's being done to help humans, live better and so forth, the better medicine. So that's compromising an important, part of Buddhism. But on the other hand, they try to lift up the practice of life, in this case, the practice of medicine. One of the interesting ways they do this is they try to instill Buddhist values in their medical school. And one of the main ways they do this is through their anatomy class. Oh, before I get to that, I'll just point out these are two women. One is the commissioner. The other woman is, by the way, basically preparing to be a kind of Buddhist nun in the world. So she's going to basically take vows of celibacy, and she's going to live the spiritual discipline of the monastery, but she's going to wear these kind of lay-style clothes, and so she can be with ordinary people and so forth, like a Catholic nun in the world today. So she can be more close to people instead of shaving her head and wearing robes and so forth.
I have a quick question. How do they self-sustain this? It sounds expensive to me. I'm just curious on how they
They have maybe $9 billion in assets, and they get it through these donations.
Strictly donations.
Donations. Basically donations. A lot of them through small donations from their regular members. And some wealthy people give them money too. And so it's all basically through donations. And they take all the money they get and they spend it on these kind of activities. So in the medical school, one of the ways they do things they do to kind of express themselves is through their anatomy class. Oh, and before that, there are different other, actually, before I get to that, this picture here is of another innovation in their hospital. So a big part of it is understanding the connection between death and life, et cetera. And so they've pioneered, among other things, palliative care, hospice care in their hospital. So at the top of the hospital, they have a hospice for terminally ill patients. And actually, here in the United States, hospitals don't have hospices, okay? You have hospices, hospitals don't do dying, okay? I mean, they do, but they don't do it intentionally. The hospices are always not connected from the hospital. But here it's part of the hospital. The hospital has it for these patients. And it's a beautiful facility. Actually, a lot of the hospice patients, they take care of at home, but some of them who aren't able to do that, they have them here, and they do all sorts of activities, including allowing them to kind of, if they want, to video record some kind of last, testament to their families and so forth, or reflections on their life and so forth if they want. And this room here is a room in the hospice which is for patients in the last hours of their life. It's a big room, and you go there's a bed, and there's plenty of space so the full family can come and so forth. And they have here these two cabinets which they open, and so one is for Buddhists, okay? And so if the person's a Buddhist and dying, they open up, that Buddhist nun come and so forth, say prayers and so forth. The other is for, if the person's a Christian, they open up the Christian one and they have a crucifix and pictures of Jesus, and a priest comes and so forth, and they have that. And so another part of them is they're very, very ecumenical. And they believe not in trying to convert people, but trying to reach out to people where they're at. So I went with them to, for instance, visit the sick, and one time, and poor and the sick. And we visited this one woman who was, she had AIDS, actually, and went to her home, and they tried to get her some food and try to, help her and clean the house and so forth and so on. And they said, oh, now we got to get some Catholic hymn. The woman's a Catholic. Said, we can't sing her any Buddhist songs, so forth. She's a Catholic. We'll sing her some Catholic hymns, so forth, and do that. So the issue was kind of meet people, where they are and not try to convert them and so forth. So that's another kind of theme that you see throughout. So, okay, here was the other thing, okay, the anatomy class. Basically, this is part of your lifting up the world. In the hospital, medical school, one of the basic courses for medical students, one that causes a lot of medical students often to drop out of medical school after it, is the anatomy class. The anatomy class is taught by having the medical students start to dissect a human cadaver to see how it's put together and so forth, and prepare for the rest of their career. In Taiwan, actually it was a crisis a few years ago because medical schools weren't getting any cadavers. Weren't getting cadavers actually because Taiwan initiated universal health care. Before that, the cadavers they got were people indigent who died on the street, unclaimed by any family and so forth, because normally the Taiwanese were reluctant to give their bodies to science. But now they gave everybody universal health care. No one died on the street. They all had hospitals to go to, and the hospitals searched their families, and no one died totally alone. So then when that happened, no one wanted to donate their bodies. But then Xi developed this way of treating these cadavers, and they have a whole set of kind of rituals that when the cadaver is brought in, first of all, the anatomy class takes place on the top floor of a medical school overlooking a beautiful garden. Usually here it takes place in the basement, and there's a big picture of the Buddha, and they bring in these kind of rituals. And then when they work on the cadaver, they have on the side these pictures of the deceased person and a little biography of them and their family, what their family was like, what their life was like, and so forth. And they call the cadaver their silent teacher, and they have this kind of relationship with it as a person who was continuing. This particular room actually is a more advanced part of the anatomy class. This is the trained surgeons, and so they practice surgery on these cadavers before they actually try to do it on a live person. In any case, but you see the picture and there's a whole biography of the person there and his life and his family. And then when they're finished with the cadaver, they have a very solemn ceremony, and the body is cremated, and the young doctors who worked on it act as the pallbearers, and they put little notes in the coffin expressing their gratitude for this person for allowing them to use their body for their education and so forth. Then the body is cremated, and then they give half the ashes to the family, back to the family, and then they keep half the ashes and they put them in these little urns in this kind of chapel, which is right next to the room where they do the anatomy class. And the students and the professors and so forth come there and they meditate and they pray with gratitude to the people who donated their bodies, and they kind of prepare themselves to understand what they're doing and all this. And so it's kind of lifting the world up and making the practice of surgery, for example, or medicine, not just a matter of treating, a person, a body like it's a piece of plumbing or something like that, just technically, but also to understand it as a person and dealing with the connection between life and death and so forth, and with respect and all that. And so here's these little urns there with the ashes of people who's donated their cadavers to Tzu Chi. So, and there's the end. I gave a talk to the nuns at the convent there. See, unlike here, they sit on the floor when they hear lectures and so forth. Anyway, so that's some of the ways in which they both kind of go down to the world and attempt to lift it up. Another thing they do, by the way, is environmental work, environmental protection. They run big operations for recycling, and they try to, invent new ways to use recycled materials and to make the earth green and so forth. So they do all these things. Now, what I argued in this book of mine is that these kinds of activities at Tzu Chi, but also Dharma Drum Mountain and so forth, really played a very positive role in Taiwan's transition to democracy, because it helped kind of generate what the sociologists call this social capital, this willingness to cooperate and reach out to others, and the spirit of care and concern and so forth. That's very important for sustaining a complicated democracy in a modern world. So, now, how to explain, let me just briefly then try to explain the differences between the situation in Taiwan, where you have this kind of new forms of religion, which basically I think have been very conducive to democracy, good relationship with the state, very, very innovative in very modern ways among the urban middle classes, and that in mainland China, where there's still these tensions and rough edges and all that. How do you explain the difference? Now, first of all, I thought that the way to explain it was that, in Taiwan, you had religious freedom, and in mainland China, you didn't, okay? But then I looked into it, realized I was wrong, that didn't work, didn't hold up. Because Taiwan, in 1950s and 60s and in 70s, in fact, was, a dictatorship, autocratic dictatorship led by, Chiang Kai-shek. And they controlled religion very strongly. The Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party that controlled Taiwan, also was heir to the so-called May 4th movement in China in 20th century China, which was secular, which believed in science and believed the modernization involved science and doing away with religion and so forth, and push scientific education and so forth, extent to religion. They try to control religion in all sorts of ways. They established a whole framework for controlling it, which was just the same as the framework that the communists use in China. The system of what the communists called patriotic associations. In Taiwan, they called the Buddhist Association, the Republic of China, which operated the same way as the Patriotic Buddhist Association in China, a government-led organization that made sure the top leaders were willing to cooperate with the government and so forth, and enabled them to do surveillance and control over lay believers. They try to control the spread of religion. They refuse to allow the Buddhist and the Taoist to do anything like establish a university or higher education institutes that would train people to become more sophisticated and so forth, and to think more about themselves, about the religion. The one exception to this was Christianity. The government in Taiwan gave more favors to Christianity. It partly did that because it's during the Cold War, 1950s and 60s, and China and Taiwan was extremely dependent on the United States for sustaining itself in the Cold War. Some of its main supporters of the United States were former missionaries who pressed the cause of free China. There were people like Walter Judd, who was a congressman from Minnesota, who had been a Protestant missionary, who was very, very active and so forth in the support of Taiwan. There was someone like Cardinal Spellman, actually, of New York, who was very, very strong advocate of the Republic of China and Taiwan. And so the government in Taiwan couldn't afford to alienate Christians, especially American Christians. And so they left all sorts of space open for Christian missionaries, for Catholic missionaries, for Protestant missionaries. They allowed the Catholics to establish a university, Furen University in Taipei, the Protestants to establish a university, Donghai University in Taichung, and allowed them to carry out all sorts of schools and all sorts of other activities. So But for the other religions, they kept them under very, very tight control. And it's very similar to what the communists tried to do in China. So you didn't have religious freedom, especially for the Buddhists. So how did these groups get going? The way they got going was that in Taiwan, there was enough of a kind of a space in a system that wasn't quite tightly controlled as in China, for people to kind of slip under the cracks of a very authoritarian system and to kind of plant little shoots. So all the people that I talked about, these monks, Xingyun from Buddhist Light Mountain, Shengyan, Zhengyan from the Tzu, they were all mavericks. Xingyun refused to belong to the Buddhist Light the Buddhist Association of the Republic of China. Shengyan actually started out as a monk in mainland China, came to Taiwan in 1949, then was drafted into the army and served as a soldier for 8 years, and then left the army and then got back into Buddhism, went in a long 3-year retreat, actually, isolated himself and so forth. Then came back and went to Japan and got a PhD in Buddhism. He was the most highly educated of all these leaders. And then only came back to Taiwan in the late 1970s. Whereas Zhengyan, he was this young woman from central part of Taiwan, and she had kind of a life crisis when she was about 21 years old, and her father died suddenly. And she went off into the mountains with a Buddhist nun, and she self-determined to become a nun. And she shaved her own head and declared herself a nun, even though there was no other monk to ordain her or anything. And it took her a while, and she finally found someone who was a leader of this reform movement in Buddhism who gave her ordination officially. And then she went to this very remote part of Taiwan, sort of the middle of nowhere, and had this little temple. And she gradually got some of the women who came to the temple to donate a little bit of money every month and works of charity, and the thing gradually grew from there. So these were all people actually who worked in fairly remote parts of Taiwan, who didn't fit in with the establishment, who found some little bit of a space and grew up these little organizations sort of under the radar. And then they started to grow more in the 1970s. And then after the mid-1970s, the government in Taiwan started to realize that society had gotten more complicated. It's become an urban society, and their social welfare needs and other needs that the government couldn't meet anymore from the top down. And so it started to call upon groups like this to kind of pitch in to help with social welfare kinds of work. And so it encouraged them to do so. And Tzu Chi, for example, won an award in around 1976 for being especially good at doing this, and got some stature because of this. And so because the government needed them, they got more of a foothold to grow. And then Tzu Chi actually built his hospital, but the government provided the land for the hospital because it needed such a place in that remote part of Taiwan in the 1980s. And the groups started to grow, but were still relatively small. But then in 1987 in Taiwan, the government rescinded its so-called martial law, which was the law justifying dictatorship. And it allowed then, after 1997, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, creation of new political parties, new kind of groups. And there was a tremendous explosion of the so-called civil society in Taiwan, and all sorts of people from every kind of group. And it was really quite chaotic. There was every kind of special interest group, every kind of identity politics group, every kind of group advocating this and that cause. And it was a very kind of rocky, roiling time. But then there were other groups, like some of these Buddhist groups, that provided an outlet for people to join up with others, but to do so in a way that was more cooperative and to understand, to develop their instincts for compassion and so forth. And that they also became kind of very attractive. And I think partly what happened was there was these kind of centrifugal forces that were tearing Taiwan apart. And the democracy even now is always on the verge of chaos. And some people say Asian countries can't have democracy. But one of the secrets why Taiwan has been able to sustain it was some of these other groups that have there's kind of new concern for the common good and so forth that then pulled the kind of centripetal force to kind of hold it all together. So that's how that, and then the membership of these groups just exploded after 1997, and it's been an upward trajectory ever since. But then what about Christianity? Part of the problem with Christianity was that Christianity, had gotten too many privileges under the old regime, and and it was those very privileges, I think, that delegitimated it in the eyes of many. And if they wanted to get back into some sort of religion, they would rather go into Buddhism, which never had been, privileged before. Also, part of it was a kind of a new kind of Taiwan nationalism. Once you get democracy, one side effect actually often is kind of a nationalism. Since you're a nation, you have a common fate and so forth. And people wanted something that was indigenous, not foreign, to kind of express their new sense of who they were and what made them special in the world. These groups have formed, the Buddhist groups I talked about have formed kind of a very special kind of outlet for feelings of Taiwan nationalism. Many people in Taiwan see themselves as a nation, really different from the Chinese and mainland China. And they see themselves as a nation, but they're a nation without a state, without a legitimate state, because the state is not recognized by almost any other body in the world officially. The state basically has to moderate between people who want to be independent from China, but also compromise, because if they try to become independent, China will attack them and so forth. The state in many ways represents their fears, not their hopes. And these religious groups represent their hopes, represent their sense of being a powerful light to the world, giving joy and care and so forth around the world is the good part of Taiwan that people like. And therefore they can go around the world. The Taiwanese government can't do that, but when they're victims of disaster around the world, these religious groups can do so and expands their consciousness that way. So it kind of represents a kind of a Taiwanese nationalism, and a particular kind of it. In Taiwan these days also you see a kind of belligerent nationalism. Chip on its shoulder, anti-China, and standing up for itself in a kind of a very sometimes aggressive way. The Buddhists kind of represent a kind of ecumenical nationalism, a cosmopolitan kind, respecting others and so forth, and wanting to be special, but without necessarily at the expense of others. So one example of this was, that was 1999, I was doing some of this research. The Taiwan election was going on, and every person who wants to win an election has to go see these Buddhist masters and pay obeisance and say, talk about morals and so forth. And so I was there at this headquarters at Tzu and the candidate for vice president in Taiwan, whose name is Annette Lu, came and see the master. And I got to sit in on the thing, and it was on this table, and it was being videoed. And so Annette Lu is extremely strong, say, assertive woman, put it this way, okay? And people in China hated her, okay, for whatever reason. She's very, very no-holds-barred kind of person. And it was quite fascinating to see her and this master Zhang Yan together, two very, very strong women, but very strong in different ways. And so Annette Lu says to the master, she says, Master, you are so wise. You're not like the leaders in mainland China, communist China. These people don't care about helping others, don't care about China. They didn't respect us and didn't give us any help. We had this terrible earthquake in Taiwan. But you give compassion and so forth to them all. And Master Zhang Yan said to her, he says, we Buddhists believe that everybody has some love in their hearts. And that includes the president of China. And so don't denounce him. Help him and so forth to bring out the best in him and so forth. And so it was this kind of a dialogue. So the Buddhist stance was to kind of help, respect, bring out the best in people and so forth, whereas others in Taiwan would want this more kind of aggressive stance. So the countries have diverged religiously in this way. Now, what does that say about the future of China? Now, I gave a talk about this, saying similar things to today in Shanghai a while ago. And present there was the head of the Buddhist studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Wang Zhiyuan, And actually, I was quite surprised. He was very excited, and it's like very excited. He says, "That's why it's going to be in China." And I said, "可能" in China means possibly. He said, "No, biran. It has to be this way." And my own stance is it's somewhere between possibly and inevitably, because you see changes in China in which the old totalitarian system is kind of cracking. It's still authoritarian, but there are more cracks in it than there were under the old days. And maybe the possibility that little shoots of these kind of things crop up. The only problem is, since you are by definition below the radar screen, you wouldn't see them until they've gone further. And so maybe something like this will happen. But then, I also believe that you can talk about big sociological, political processes, but they're never the only thing that count in all this. And so what also counts are things like quality of leadership and creativity of leadership in particular circumstances, and what the Buddhists call causes and conditions. And that's totally non-predictable. And so probably all that depends on what the Buddhists would call good karma, and maybe Christians would call the grace of God. But we'll have to see how it all turns out. So that's enough for now. I'm sorry if I went too long.
Dr. Rachel Madsen agreed to take a few. Thank you so much. Okay, you must be 60. He can take some questions. Okay, we have a microphone here. They are codeless. So if you feel your volume is too low, you're welcome to use this. We have work science students here. They can make it.
Could I just ask you, very interesting. One thing that was left out when you were talking about how the Christianity was not probably they were looking for the indigenous Buddhism to rally around and so on. I wonder if they were looking for indigenous culture in China. Why it wasn't Confucianism or Taoism, and after all, even Buddhism originally came to China from without. Do you have any studies on why the rallying point? And I know that those are perhaps more philosophies than organized religions in some sense, but why not the traditions of Confucianism, Taoism, Why didn't they come into play?
Some of them are actually coming back, and the government is actually trying to push them as a kind of antidote to Christianity. One place where the Christians grow more rapidly in China is in those areas where during the Cultural Revolution, the basic religious landscape was scoured clean in the places where all the temples were destroyed and so forth and so on. And there was kind of a vacuum, and I think it's been filled to some degree by Christianity. So that's one answer. Other places where the temples had survived and so forth, you get more of the revival of this kind of folk religion. But the government's worried about this Christianity, would like to kind of choke it out. Another place, though, is in the cities. And I have an interpretation, I'm not sure if it's true or not, but in 1989, you had these demonstrations in Tiananmen Square. One of the big themes of the demonstration was the corruption of Chinese tradition, how China had to go forward. This has been a long theme in the 20th century. And the tradition was autocratic, was opaque, and so forth, kept people down, okay? And then people demonstrated in Tiananmen Square because of that, and it got crushed. After that, some of the leaders in the government started to think these people were against tradition. Tradition must be good. So there's kind of a nationalistic kind of evocation of tradition. In the meantime, this generation of 1989 that got crushed and faced all sorts of existential crises because of that are fed up with this appeal to tradition, and Christianity has been more kind of appealing to them. So you get a number of intellectuals in places like Beijing who become dissidents, mainly from that period, 89, and have looked to Christianity, especially Protestant Christianity, as a kind of a spiritual nourishment and moral support. So, for example, Liu Xiaobo, who won the Nobel Prize, is now in prison, for 11 years. He never got baptized as a Christian, but sort of hangs out with Christians and says he's very, close to Christianity. He got this actually when he was in prison, one of his, not the term before this in prison, he somehow got hold of a book by Hans Kuhn, Why Be a Christian? And that fascinated him and so forth, and it became his journey toward Christianity. Before that, he was a follower of Nietzsche, actually. So that's one path. Then there are others. A disproportionate number of these so-called rights lawyers who have been trying to push the envelope on human rights and getting thrown into prison and worse because of it are actually Christians, maybe close to 50% of them, far out of proportion to, population numbers. And again, it's partly because they see the tradition being used and manipulated by the government in this way. I suppose maybe one takeaway from all this is, and you get this lesson from Taiwan too, when the government tries to control a religion to kind of, pursue its own kinds of interests, it gives religion some boost for a while, but then it turns people off. And when the government control loosens, they look to something they consider authentic, which was not controlled by the government, So that could be going on in China, and it's parallel with kind of a mirror image with like Buddhism and so forth in Taiwan. So that's my at least semi-speculative answers to that right now. Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, during the time of the suppression, what forms of, especially in mainland China, was there an underground form of Christianity? Were there underground forms? And when the revival happened, was it from those underground churches, if they existed, or was it an import in some way?
No, it was, well, a bit of both, but I think we got to see that there were these underground forms that sort of persisted. They had to be kept really underground, though, and among the Christians, leaders, priests, bishops, so forth, were imprisoned and so forth, and it was very difficult. Lay people carried on the faith just quietly in their homes, and often actually women, grandmothers, teaching their grandchildren, this kind of thing. And then in the temple worship, there was these kind of things also in the home, although you couldn't have temples, etc. Okay, so there was that, and then it started to come back even in the 1970s before the thing opened up. According to one study I read, very interesting, that one thing that got the rise of this Protestant Christianity, evangelical Christianity going, was temples had been destroyed, and women were some of the chief kind of propagators of this kind of evangelical Pentecostal sort of Christianity. For one thing, it's simple. You don't need like theology books and this kind of thing to do it. And you could do it without a temple. So it was like actually the Jewish people, when their temple was destroyed and so forth, you have Christianity is more free-floating for any kind of temple. And actually in the old folk religion, it's male-dominated. That is, the women have this piety, but the men run the temples and all the temple worship and so forth. But now women who got the Spirit could say, we're as good as any of these men ever were. We have a more powerful God and so forth. And there are all these traumas people had gone through. And so that helped make it, catch fire, even when the repression was going on. So there were kind of roots, embers that then kind of, burst into flame. And then after the government loosened its policies up, only partially though, but after 1980, then there was space for many more people either come back to the faith or to look for new ways to, find meaning, et cetera. And then there's been this kind of mushrooming sort of ever since. So basically, it's like that. Most of it not from outside, I think. I mean, there's missionary activity in China now and stuff, and people, they go abroad to study, for instance, and they bring it back and so forth. But I think it's basically an indigenous phenomenon.
Any other questions?
Quick question. I was interested in the follow-up when you said once there was socialized medicine in Taiwan, the homeless were taken off the streets, therefore there were no kind of cadavers that were available. But the way they honored the dead with rituals and bringing the families in and taking urns. Do you have a statistic how that did the populace respond to that type of treatment?
Well, yeah, because actually, for one thing, the Buddhist hospital, they actually get lots of cadavers. They get some of their followers and so forth that donate, their bodies, and actually, and it's spread throughout Taiwan. So they actually get more cadavers they know what to do with, and they give them to other medical schools as long as they promise to treat them in the same way. Okay, so they have kind of an overabundance. Even the picture I showed, that was like a mock. Operating room where they can practice surgery on these cadavers, and most medical schools can't do that. Cadavers are too hard to come by. So, but they feel this is an advantage. They can, practice their skills on a real cadaver before they try it in real life. So they have more than they know what to do with in a way because of this. So it's caught on. And this has been a kind of change in consciousness in Taiwan, because part of the traditional folk religion is your body is sacred and should not be, dismembered or anything like that. And so this really amounts to kind of changing people's consciousness. So there's a modernization that goes on. And I guess that's one of the main themes in these Buddhist groups, a kind of a modernization of Buddhism to meet new realities, and while retaining kind of a link, say, with the past, with the tradition. Another thing you see is these testimonials of people who join these groups, like Tzu, for instance, and then they write these testimonials out. And a typical story is, I grew up in a village, in Taiwan, a little village, and then I went to school and I went to university, and maybe even I went abroad. I got a PhD, and now I'm really successful, but my parents are still back in the village. I don't know how to be filial to them. Okay. I love them, but I don't know how to be a filial son or daughter to them anymore because I'm far away, they're there, I have a whole different lifestyle, a whole different understanding and so forth. And then the Buddhists say, well, here's how, okay? You're part of this vast world. Our group will also help your parents. Your parents will be proud of you because of your generously given to others and so forth. And you'll be able to be filial, traditional virtue, but in a different way than in the past when you were all there together in this big family. And so part of what's going on here is attempt to kind of take these old values and kind of reinterpret them so you can live in a more, modern style life, but still feel you're connected to, what you think of as the best in this tradition. So that's very creative.
That compromising, is mainland China contrasting that sort of?
Mainland China mainland China, thing is too conflicted, okay? So one thing is you can't really have any kind of sophisticated study of Buddhism or other religion, for that matter, even Catholicism, actually, because the government puts too much of a control over it. It doesn't want, people to become intelligent thinkers about this kind of thing, right? And that's what they did in Taiwan, too, in the 50s and 60s. They don't want people to be educated as Buddhist or stuff like that, and to do advanced theology and stuff. They see that as dangerous. So in Taiwan, that's a bit of a problem. So you have a problem, I think, of training of priests in the Catholic Church, but also of ministers, but also of Buddhists and other, kinds of religious people. They don't make it possible for them to be very well trained and to be able to think creatively about how to adapt the faith. And if they try to do it, government would start getting worried and step in, and then they have to devote a lot of their energy just to kind of keeping, surviving in this situation. So the opportunities for this kind of creativity, which I think is a genuine religious creativity you see in Taiwan, aren't there at this moment. Maybe will be, but not there now.
Would it be like a parallel to 19th century Europe and America with the Second Great Awakening and the Age of Enlightenment?
There's things like that, yeah. I think so. Also, even in America, I think some of this stuff, like the Taiwan, the Buddhism, it reminds you a little bit of the social gospel kind of movement in America, religion serving the world and so forth, not just a pure kind of detached sort of spirituality, all this kind of thing. But then it's also connected with Buddhist tradition. There's kind of a worldliness is also part of it, which is more difficult kind of theologically in say, the Christian tradition, not impossible, but there's a different kind of intellectual logic that is behind these things as well, I think.
Okay, I think it's almost 9 o'clock, and I think we have wonderful introduction piece tonight. So thank you so much for being here, and let's give our speaker a hand. Okay, thank you, and have a safe trip home, or walk home, or drive home. Thank you.